Welcome to Pause and Pivot, our weekly literary cafe where curious minds gather to explore big ideas from books that help us to live more thoughtfully, grow more intentionally, and discover deeper meaning in our lives. Rather than simply reviewing books, we treat them as invitations to conversations, spaces where psychology, philosophy, culture, and lived experience meet around the table. We're so happy you're here. And if you enjoy thoughtful conversations about books and big ideas, consider subscribing to the channel so you can join us each week for a new Cafecito chat. So, welcome to Pause and Pivot. I'm Margarita V, your host, and I share that mujerista energy, blending ancient wisdom with modern science. And today I am honored to be joined by my wonderful co host, Urchana, who brings a thoughtful lens on personal growth and inner transformation, and Colin, whose love of philosophy and big ideas always helps us see deeper patterns across traditions. I'm always grateful to share these conversations with both of you and with our listeners online. So, this month we're focusing on women's wisdom, where we're exploring books that highlight the voices and insights of women across cultures and spiritual traditions. Throughout history, women mystics, philosophers, and teachers have shaped humanity's search for wisdom, even when their voices weren't always fully recognized. So, this month we are taking time to pause, reflect, and explore some of those voices together. So, our book for today is Women of Wisdom by Paula Marvelly. So, this book is a powerhouse. It's almost 300 pages, and it takes us on a fascinating journey across cultures and centuries, introducing women, mystics, philosophers, and spiritual teachers whose insights help shape humanity's search for meaning. And if you're someone who loves discovering meaningful books, you can download our weekly worksheet by subscribing to our newsletter. It looks like this, and it just gives you some amazing questions and spaces to capture the big ideas from each of our book wisdom conversation series. And you'll receive the weekly handouts to track your reading journey. So before we dive into the big ideas, I want to say hello to the co-hosts and just check in and see, have you heard of this book idea before? What are some of the ideas that you're curious to explore? So I'd love to check in with you.
Um, I had not heard of the book before, but I have been very aware of Women of Wisdom. And in my own journey, um, I first became aware of the idea of women as being spiritual leaders from my own Maori heritage, which, while it's famous for being a warrior culture, it's actually a matriarchal order.
Mm.
And my own grandmother was known as a healer. There are stories about her healings. There are stories about how she witnessed, like, my dad always talked about one time he was walking on a path and a lizard ran across the path, and all of a sudden she stopped and she just said, Uncle Bill just died. I mean, nature would bring messages of spirit to her. So the idea of women and wisdom, my own mother was she would have hated me saying this, but she was psychic. She was incredibly intuitive. So this is something very close to my heart, and I love the energy of it. Thank you, Maggie.
I love it. Thank you, Colin. And Richana, I know this is going to hit home for you in a big way. What are some of the insights or ideas that you can't wait to dive into?
Yeah, it certainly does. And thanks for sharing that, Colin. I think, that definitely resonates with me on a personal note. And this book just spoke to me on so many levels, personally and professionally, both in exploration and inquiry through an anthropological lens, as well as personally, especially certain themes, if you will, in terms of reclaiming wisdom and women of wisdom, rather. And so, yes, definitely resonated on so many levels. And there's so much there to unpack. So it's a marvelous book.
It is, and I love her last name, Marvelly, right? Some of the superheroes, super marvels. So we're going to run into a lot of these superheroes here. So let's go ahead and dive into the author for today's Cafecito chat, focusing on Women of Wisdom by Paula Marvelly. Let's dive in a moment to talk about the author. Paula Marvelly is a writer, researcher, and cultural commentator whose work explores the intersection of spirituality, philosophy, literature, and the arts. She studied English at Royal Holloway College, University of London, and later completed a postgraduate research degree in European Studies at the University of Cambridge. She's also creator and editor of an online publication called The Culturium, which she founded almost 10 years ago. The site serves as a contemplative space for exploring themes such as spirituality, mysticism, creativity, and cultural history, featuring essays, interviews, book reviews, and many reflections of writers. So her work often focuses on the spiritual and philosophical dimensions of culture, examining how literature, art, and religious traditions shape humanity's search for meaning. So to read more and learn about her, please visit her website at www.theculturium.com. So we're going to be focusing in on this one book, and the book summary is that it takes us on a fascinating journey across cultures and centuries, introducing women mystics, philosophers, and spiritual teachers whose insights help shape humanity's search for meaning. So, for today's conversation, rather than trying to summarize the entire book, which is really impossible, we've selected four big ideas that stood out to us as especially meaningful for modern life. So we'll just look at those one at a time. And in this literary cafe, it's a conversation. So we invite you to post your comments and your questions, whether you're online or in the live session here. Think of this less as a lecture and more of a literary cafe conversation. So with that, let's go ahead to big idea number one. So the idea of big idea number one is to look at the lens of the sacred feminine as a hidden lineage of wisdom throughout the ages. It's one of the central insights of Women of Wisdom, which is that women have always played a vital role in the spiritual life of humanity as mystics, philosophers, teachers, poets, and visionaries. Yet their contributions were often marginalized, forgotten, or intentionally even erased from historical records. The book dives into the cultures and the centuries of where the feminine wisdom appears again and again as a symbol of wisdom and divine insight. So, in many traditions, wisdom itself is personified as feminine. There are so many examples. There are books that focus, the chapters focus on unique wisdom guides, like Sophia in early Christian and Gnostic traditions, or Hokmah in Jewish mysticism, or Saraswati in Hindu philosophy, or Tara in Tibetan Buddhism, and so many more. This book is just impossible to really grasp fully. So, reading it over and over again will bring greater insights to show that even in societies that became increasingly patriarchal over the years, feminine wisdom continue to appear in symbolic and mystical form. So this book is amazing. It's a revelation that women's spiritual voices were never truly absent. Instead, they formed that hidden lineage of wisdom, quietly influencing spiritual traditions across cultures. So as we think about these and the idea of the millennia, of all of these wisdom traditions and where they appeared in the different countries and the different traditions. Why does this matter today? Thinking of Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley or China, in these different places where there are distinct lineages, how do they apply to our lives today? And why does it matter that we even think about recovering the lineage of feminine wisdom for our modern times? So, for our modern readers, this book suggests that women are not inventing new spiritual pathways, but you might have tapped into what might be happening in your community or online community or around the world, this sort of search for community, for more meaning and connection. And in some ways, a return to feminine wisdom is one way we can explore new ways to live those ancient wisdom for modern times. So I'm curious, my fellow co-host, as we dive into this amazing book, again, Women of Wisdom, just an amazing a treasure of a chest, which before you guys share, I don't know how I got this book. It's one of those things like, how does a book come into your lap? I was visiting my stepson in Eugene, Oregon for Thanksgiving, and we all went, this motley crew went to a bookstore in the downtown, beautiful downtown Eugene. And again, I wasn't looking for this book. It just kind of popped out, and I am so glad that I found it. I read it twice now, and I think it's taken over 14 hours to read because I just kept rereading and rereading to get the timeline and the different epochs and the different names and the different foreign languages, and to just barely grasp the concept, that so much of this wisdom has always been with us. So I'm excited to dust off some of these ideas and concepts and to dive in. So, what's landing for you guys? What do you think women's spiritual voices? How often have they been excluded from mainstream conversations? How is that landing with you?
I almost don't know where to begin, quite frankly, because in the beginning, um, because hidden lineage, right? So that alone, I love to unpack that. That could be this whole show. Um, I I'm going to start with Hatshepsut because I met her in college when I was taking Egyptology for my because I was getting my undergraduate degree in cultural anthropology, and I met Hatshepsut, and it just blew my mind. She just blew me. Her story blew me away. A pharaoh, a female pharaoh, and pharaoh. The etymology of pharaoh is house of. So speaking from a seat of authority, the house of lineage, the great house of, and then and then that against the context of stratified societies of and how there was a shift in leadership. So women were leaders historically, but their stories, they're few, right, in between, including Hatshepsut. And then they'd have to assume literally the garb of, the male uh, pharaohs themselves. So she literally, from what I understand, dressed like a male pharaoh, and have to, don that garb, and yet she ruled from a seat of authority. So for myself, I found this really resonated for me in terms of hidden lineage. And there's so many others, as I said, I could unpack, but I'm just going to leave it with the Hatshepsut story.
And for me, what has been an awareness that started to grow is the critical nature of what I would call the divine feminine, where, in recent history, especially since the Judeo-Christian kind of domination of our world, at least the Western world, the male patriarchy has subjugated women to their own ideas and all these things. But just the names that are named in the book that you shared, Maggie, I think point to this really subtle thing that and this is a neuroscientific and a psychological idea at its core, and that is the subconscious is where the true power rests. And in my opinion, this is what is pointed to with these wonderful, wonderful women.
Thank you for those comments. I love it. And yeah, the subconscious, this book really dives into the different philosophies where the focus is mostly on the non-being or the non-duality, and then how some of the different traditions focus on exclusively the body or exclusively not the body. And it's very interesting how they kind of pivot. And then we get into later eras where then they bring them together, the yin and the yang. So it's the complementarity of it towards the end. But in the very beginning, Urchin, I can't believe you just dived into that first one. I mean,
Sorry.
it's so
In fact,
complex.
I was just gonna add Hatshepsut was for me the one that resonated the most.
Yeah, and you're right about her being perceived as male. So Hatshepsut was seen as the personification of Mat, the feminine equilibrium source of the universe from which the masculine gods like Re were given form. So it's like the feminine first, then they gave form to the masculine. And then it says later on, somewhat bizarrely, she begins to be perceived as male, presumably in an attempt to validate her rule. So even as a pharaoh, to validate her rule, it's a very it's interesting. They are the rulers, and yet the feminine is still undervalued and seen as secondary. So this theme continues in so many different ways and in different ways in the cultures. Um, it almost becomes really hard to read because you see the pattern. So the interesting thing of a book like this is the anthology of it is that it shows patterns, the repeat patterns. And so the idea of know your history so we don't relive it, can takes on a new meaning when it comes to things that matter, wisdom and traditions that help to guide our lives. So thank you for sharing those. And again, it's just the general and brief idea of recognition that throughout the ages, how the fluctuation and the diminution of recognizing the wisdom from feminine and women-led traditions and then to sort of silencing them. So recognizing the pattern and that it has happened. So with that, let's go ahead and look at another idea from this amazing book. Each chapter again dives into a whole new aspect of culture, traditions, a whole new place on the earth, very rich and diverse. I encourage you to check it out for all of the details into the different chapters. But a common idea that we saw throughout the different chapters was the idea of like direct experience of the divine. The idea, powerful theme running throughout Women of Wisdom is the idea that true spiritual understanding comes not from doctrine or intellectual knowledge alone, but from direct experience, the knowing, the wisdom of knowing it. Many of the mystics and teachers discussed in the book emphasize the truths that truths must be lived in order to be truly known. They must be felt in order to have that connection and meaning. They must be experienced to be fully digested so that it can then be embodied wisdom. So rather than relying solely on institutional authority, dogma, or inherited belief systems, these traditions emphasize a sort of inner realization. And there's many, many themes, again, throughout the book, through multiple spiritual traditions that are very diverse and explored in this book in depth, such as Gnosticism, that emphasizes self-knowledge as the path to divine understanding. And then also Sufism was reviewed a few times, emphasizing the direct experience of divine love. And many Christian mystics were emphasized, focusing on that inward union with God, that personal union with God. And then, of course, Hindu philosophy was mentioned in several times and how it also influenced many other traditions, including Taoism, how that was emphasized, the intuitive knowing beyond conceptual thought. So many, many traditions sharing their insights and how they shaped major wisdom traditions. So throughout the ages, why does this matter now? Thinking about so many different cultures are from around the world and from so long ago. If we really look around and what's happening in the world, and for a while now, we've discussed in Man's Search for Meaning how he even saw the pattern of this sort of existential frustration or void or despair, with so many things around the world, people feeling like they don't have control, too many changes, so much instability. And so now today, even many people feel that sort of disconnection, that disillusionment, with purely institutional or governmental leaders, right? And as we look at the spiritual practice, the same applies. who to follow. There's so many leaders, spiritual leaders that are being, looked at, reframed with certain occurrences happening in our modern life right now. So, what is our current approach to viewing institutions, to organizations, to spirituality? There is this growing interest in practices, personal practices that can cultivate what this book is kind of referring to as like their direct experience with not only God, but beauty and truth, and some more of those values and virtues that were highly coveted and sought for throughout the ages. And some of the practices that they mentioned were like meditation and contemplation, reflective inquiry. And as we've mentioned, a lot of the books that we talk about are dealing with Stoicism, right? So different ways to kind of pause, and then so that we can then discern how will we pivot. So I'm curious to see, when we're looking at this big idea number two of direct experience of the divine, given the AI culture in which we are in, and we are always being sort of taken externally and in a speed format. We're almost like human routers, right? I think it was Cal Newport in one of his books that says we don't want to be like human routers where we're just taking in information as quickly as possible and then as quickly as possible sharing it back out without that depth. So that's why we're here to pause so that we create this space for that inner contemplation. And what's more is that we can connect on these ideas. So it's not just reading the books, it's pausing and connecting with others to share what's coming up for us and to find that common ground. So what's coming up for you guys when we're talking about this idea? What's the difference between learning and wisdom?
This is actually a big deal in my life because and well, I'm going to focus a little bit on the women's side of it, because I really believe that for a long time, and even in my own cultural experience of growing up in the US with an immigrant father, where the feminine from his world was one of the spiritual powerhouses, and it wasn't uncommon to have a matriarch, although the Maori priesthood was male, the heart of the home and all that. So this idea of the experience, the individual experience of the divine, in my opinion, is a foretelling of what we're moving into. Because if you look around, everything is moving into decentralization. The traditional static structures that most egos have relied upon to give themselves internal structure based on the exterior structure is falling apart right now. I mean, it's all falling apart. All the things we've all trusted, the governments, the religions, the corporations, and they're all showing up, and you're realizing a lot of these people are not what I thought they were. And it's forcing. I had a conversation with one of my sisters a long time ago, and it turned out, as I was the eldest, and I grew up with 5 sisters. I've mentioned this before, 5 sisters, really close to my mom. And so I'm really close to and feel connected to the feminine energy. But I remember having a conversation with her this one day, and I had made some decisions that led me away from the family tradition, spiritual tradition. And she said, when you did that, it forced me to get my own answers. And I think that's where we're headed now. And so I think this idea of realizing that the feminine had these direct experiences, the feminine has these direct experiences, and that I think it's time for us to acknowledge that and embrace it.
That is so well stated, Colin. Thank you for stating that, because I think the thesis being, the thesis of decentralization is so, and you're so right, foretelling as far as, because how I was thinking about it in relation to that was, there are lineages that have been operating on this and with that lens of almost dichotomous lens. It's nature versus nurture. And yet we have feminine wisdom, which has been there all along. It is in our nature to nurture. So I think that's where that, hidden lineage of wisdom is, in this climate of continuing climate, evolving climate of decentralization, it is really, it is unfolding. So it's really incredible. And this book is really, as I said, lots there to unpack. I had so much fun with this.
Yeah, and I think they just republished it in 2024. So there is a growing interest, my friends. This was published in 2005. And I think I just saw that it was reprinted. So I am so happy to be introducing this book and the work by Paula Marvelly. So I hope everybody can check out her website and learn more about this, the reemergence and refocus on feminine principles. It's not male, female. It's the concept of quality of consciousness. How are we showing up? In what frequency are we thinking, feeling, and acting? And then how are we living in congruence with our lives, with those around us? Are we aware of that? So given how the fast pace of technology, the way in which we are morphing into, above the neck living with just our head, working less and less with our body, we are generally tending to separate ourselves from the living traditions that connect us with nature. Whether it's living with nature or whether it's bringing in some of those more natural based healing traditions. So understanding that there is that sort of wisdom where we can combine, it's not either or, it's the complementarity. So these ideas are really well discussed and at such a high level from many traditions, such as the yoga philosophy, the Shad Darshan, the six philosophies from yoga that go deep into the sort of different levels of consciousness. So for me, that's sort of the lens I bring into the conversation. And I know that Urchana can also speak to that with, her view with anthropology and then also through the lens of Indian philosophy and how there are feminine principles, there are the chakras, there are different ways to look at the interconnectedness of everything and the different ways that we can look at oneness. Whether you look at it through we are separate, so we need patterns and systems of transformation that unite us, or we look at everything as oneness and we are trying to lift the veil of illusion that keeps us hidden from recognizing that oneness as it is. So it almost doesn't matter which path we take. The importance is that we, as you saw through the integration of these systems, is to follow a path, to find something that has connection and meaning and that is of relevance to you. That's why I found this book so amazing because of the not only the depth, but the breadth from Mesopotamia all the way throughout the ages and through different cultures and the different lenses. So she expands on it in her website, and I can't wait to dive in. This is something to also this we could spend another year in this book, right? And Urchina was mentioning we should probably do 2 sessions on this, but the idea is this, in this chapter, in this pause and pivot, we are here to just use the book as a spark, to share some big ideas, not the whole book, just to share these things that might land with you. So grab your wellness journal, or grab the handout that we give every session so you can capture your big ideas and ask yourself if this is the book that you want to add to your reading list. Okay, so welcome back, Urchina. Great to have you back with us. So big idea number 3 is this view of the systems, the different systems of transformation throughout the ages. So, one of the most fascinating aspects in this book is that it reveals not only inspiring stories, but the many different ways that cultures have formed different structured pathways of transformation. She noted that many women mystics describe sort of these different pathways, identifiable stages, or even practices Some of them challenged religious authority. Some of them were about social resistance or shared visions and insights that expanded spiritual understanding. So, some of the beautiful new insights and practices that she shared were including things like the concept of the chakra system in tantric traditions, um, the Sufi stations of the soul. I thought that was amazing. And she also talks about Hildegard of Bingen's sort of sharing a metaphor of the soul growing like a living tree. We've probably seen a tree in many different traditions. So I think she points it out in two or three different traditions here. And then the beautiful way that the Taoist practices talk about self inquiry and inner emptiness. And then Marguerite Poretes, she offers 7 stages of spiritual development. And she wraps it up for me, Sri Aurobindo and his amazing consciousness transformational with integral yoga and the connection to the 4 aspects of the Divine Mother. So I could go on, but just to give you an idea that through the book, there are many, many systems of transformation, compiling decades, hundreds of years, millennia of known wisdom or heard wisdom or inspired wisdom that then became coalesced into a cultural understanding, an embodiment, and began to create rituals whereby people then began to practice these values and understanding of how they connect to each other, to the meaning, and to the world. So many wonderful examples here, and the systems for transformation, they were intentional. They were intentionally compiled and lovingly shared like a light that is going to warm the soul of those that they're sharing it with. And many of them included things like reflection, having a teacher and a student, having the sense of devotion to the learning, also taking action, the act of surrender, and the conscious practice. So in this group, we always kind of go into the modern take, how can we look at these ancient wisdom practices and say, how is it relevant now? Who has time for a discipline to, study with someone after you've done school and career? And the real question is, what's stopping us from continuing our evolution of our personal upward spiral in our mission in life, in our connection to our purpose or our dharma? School is not the end of our learning or our evolution. So it's an open invitation now to think about what we think of the end of learning and the beginning of wisdom. So through the traditions, through the practices, why this matters now for our readers here in our beautiful online channel and community is that we're joining here from around the world, and even here in the US, we are a multicultural conglomeration. And my vision, with my mujerista lens, is I playfully say we're not here as a cultural soup where we dive into the soup and disappear with our unique attributes, culture, and values. We're more like an ensalada. So we're that American ensalada, right? Where we bring our juicy cucumber nature or our ripe red tomato or our soft crisp lettuce as different nutritious elements in our culture. So as we're thinking of this, if this is something that, jibes with you, we think about where do we get personal guidance if we're not here with our own culture? If we're here sort of in a mixture, it's kind of hard to find where to go, who to listen to, who to gather with in our spiritual development or in our personal quest for inner truths. So when we're thinking about these as traditions and personal pathways of transformation, I'm curious what's coming up for you guys, either in your personal practices or what you're hearing as trends. So
Well, this is a point that I really felt attracted to, and when you invited me to be here and to comment, and frankly, it's a big one because I was born and raised in a very specific and structured tradition. The thing I think that this points to that really attracts me and is something that I'm interested in right now is that on the surface, each one of these women of wisdom bring a perspective, a practice. They use different languages, symbols, all these things, but they were structured for their cultures. And yet, when you pull back and take the 30,000-foot view, it actually, in my opinion, has a couple of interesting intersection points from each lens. One of the most important being that means a lot to me is that they're pointing to a process, not a single outcome. This is something that I'm personally invested in. And I mean, like, for example, when you spoke of the trees are not a one and done moment, they're a process. And every one of them had a suggestion of practice, reflection, discipline, integration. And so while some of these women, and throughout history, men too, but some of them did have a moment that kind of set them on their path, or some of them were born to it and just knew from the beginning, but they all demonstrated a practice, a revelation over time. And so I guess what I would ask is, does it actually point to different lines of spiritual wisdom, or is it all describing a singularity of wisdom, all from different cultural lenses? That's kind of what I came through.
That's a great question. And I think I'll take that. For myself, I think that's where it speaks to the embodiment of transformation and the personalization. And I was reminded of, inspired by the story of Rosa Parks, one of my favorite books. I don't know if you can see this, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. It's an incredible, incredible book, and also marked up. But and it talks about how women provided the backbone of the boycott as walkers, drivers, organizers, and fundraisers. Parks had spent much more than a decade before the boycott, wrestling her own fear and drawing on her own faith to make stand after stand against racial injustice. And she said, and there's an excerpt, "I learned much myself," Parks later reflected. For her, it was a lesson in organizing and how people had to move past fear on their own and how much power they possessed once they did. So I think that is, there's singularity there in terms of process. This is a process. She didn't just show up and decide to boycott, and decades in the embodiment of transformation. So I think that's absolutely the case. Thank you for bringing that up, Colin.
Oh boy, Colin. What a question. And thank you, Archana, for reading that, Rosa Parks. That's always inspiring from many different sources, right? So exploring these deeper values and purpose, having a system of transformation can be really helpful, don't you think? When we don't come with a handbook. This could be a handbook and you get to decide, I'm going to take chapter 3 for this phase in my life and then chapter 10 as I get older. And again, for me, the discovery of yoga and the Shadarshan, the Advaita Vedanta, these, as well as logotherapy, have really influenced how I perceive the world, how I form my own paradigm, understanding not only myself, but how I interact with the world. So I'm curious for you guys, what is influencing you now, if you care to share anything? Like, I will grab two of my favorite things. You know me, I'm all about anointing, so I love to bring the power of the senses. So again, that's one of the traditions, the tantric traditions that emphasize the power of the senses to connect us, our internal thoughts and emotions with our external inputs, and how we choose to anoint ourselves so we show up with that. So that's just kind of playful, but it's not. It's actually something I do repeatedly throughout the day, choosing the nature concoction that I want to bring into. And the smell is almost directly connected to the brain. So it's instantly communicating with the brain. And now the brain is communicating with the body. So in this small way, I am including some of these ancient traditions and practices and bringing nature to inform me as I show up moment to moment, day to day. I'm curious, you guys, you have anything coming up you want to share for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and Urchina mentioned a word that I think is really key here, and what you just demonstrated, Maggie, is the embodiment, because it's that step that you talked about from learning to understanding. You can have a ton of wisdom in your head. I mean, sorry, learning facts in your head, but until it converts to lived experience, to somatic lived experience, then you, well, I'm not going to say it. I was going to talk about how a lot of the masculine energy I've lived with talks from their head, not from their heart. But and me included, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm telling you from my own experience. But just that brief moment where you talked about the ancient practice, the olfactory sense, the oldest sense in the human body, the shortest timeline between the sense and the brain. It's incense has always been used. Smell has always been used to get us into that state. Sounds, the tingsha from the Tibetan, the chanting, all of these point to things that bring us into that lived experience. And in my opinion, the embodiment is the divine feminine. The living, breathing embodiment is the feminine energy of feelings. And in my opinion, until the spiritual experience is felt, it's just a story.
Beautiful. Thank you, Colin. And thank you for sharing that from your perspective, understanding and fully acknowledging the distinction of the feminine wisdom while embracing your role as you are here as a masculine energy, fully supporting both feminine and masculine. And that reminds me of Meister Eckhart Tolle, who I didn't really know much about, but she does talk about him, and I'm so glad to learn a little bit more about him. And he was such a supporter of feminine, the divine wisdom. So if you want to learn more about that, it's in here as well. And to understand that there's a very important concept in here. It could be big idea number 5, especially for our modern times, about transcending gender identity. And that many traditions, and especially when it comes to their leaders like Hatshepsut, is that how you say her name? Hatshep, how do you say that?
Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut, I think.
Yeah, that's a
At
hard
least
one for
that's how
me.
I was introduced to her.
I was trying to read their names and I was like, oh my God, these are literally foreign languages. They're beautiful, brilliant names. And so it's almost like we're having a battle in our brain to say this is the leader, and in our brain we can only understand leader as being masculine or male. And so it's almost an internal struggle to say the divine feminine, but she serves man. So there's a lot of that, and that's why in the later traditions there's a lot more of the complementarity of the yin yang, the masculine with the feminine within. So when the masculine has exhausted itself, then it blossoms into the feminine. When the feminine has exhausted itself, then it blossoms into the masculine. And so it's the Shiva and the Shakti, and so many of these different traditions and the different um, processes. It's about a process. So, how do we step into this river of development as we understand ourselves and the changing nature of life itself? So, having sort of a guidebook, being blessed by having a culture that you understand, given to your by your parents, being born in a country, monocultural countries, they're becoming few and far between, right? But big nations like India, mostly Hindu, right? China, mostly what? Buddhist, Taoist? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's Buddhist, mostly Buddhist.
Buddhist,
Or
Buddhist.
well, they've got the Taoist and the Confucius,
There's
but
different,
very, very Buddhist too.
right? Latin America, Catholics, mostly, right? Mostly, but not totally. But you come to America, you come to different countries around the world now where we're becoming a mix. And there's less and less of these containers that bring the whole guidance of who we are by our culture, our food, our language, and those unconscious cultural cues that guide us on how to show up. So it's a question of great relevance and timely application to invite everyone to really consider, what are my beliefs around how I am showing up? What are my values? Am I living them? And can I explore sort of revisiting the roots of these wisdom traditions from my own cultural lineage or my adopted nation's culture? Or if you're here as an immigrant, welcome to the land of opportunity where you can decide to bring the amazing wisdom from your culture and your country and to form your own cultures of community, community of cultures of practice. Oh boy. So you guys got to stop me. You got to like ring a bell and say, that's enough. Any comments from there before we move into big idea number 4?
No, I'm feeling good about where we're at. Thank you.
Truly amazing to be here. Every time we meet, it's a gift. It's truly, I feel blessed. I feel grateful. I feel enriched, and my cup is truly filled. So, my friends, you listening at home, grabbing, your worksheet, making sure that you're jotting down what's coming up for you. Not so much the answers, but even the questions. If we can start to live the questions, this can really enrich our lives. Okay, friends, let's go to big idea number 4. Idea number 4 is looking at this trend of feminine wisdom from suppression to reclamation, to reclaim that hidden wisdom. And there are many invitations from the book to live with greater awareness. And, this is sort of a difficult but important theme throughout the book. And that's that women's spiritual authority has often been suppressed. Many women, many males have sought to seek deeper meaning in life. However, throughout the ages, many women mystics faced significant resistance, including, being excluded from religious leadership, also feeling persecution and censorship and social marginalization. For many women, they were questioned, their value, their inherited assumptions, um, and they learn to listen and be patient, and to live with the wisdom across the cultures. So some of the traditions and wisdom that she shared in the book, and one of the highlights for me was to review and understand fully the other story of Eve. So if you're curious about that, I highly encourage you to get that, because that in itself is worth getting the whole book. So if you've never heard of this, the other story of Eve, I encourage you to get the book to learn more about that. Instead of the demonization of Eve, I don't know how to say that word, in traditional interpretations, it's a totally new tale of where Eve is the one that's bringing the wisdom and is bringing Adam to life. So we can do a deep dive onto that one if you like. And there's also other ideas of looking at the marginalization of Mary Magdalene, also the persecution of many female mystics such as Marguerite Porete, and many other women's spiritual voices. It was almost kind of hard to read all of them. And yet, despite all of the obstacles, the wisdom that these women shared throughout the ages continue to survive through their poetry. Many of these sage feminine wisdom leaders wrote poetry as if it was coming from the bosom of their chest, from the soul, from their inner heart, from their inner daimon. And they shared in oral traditions and formed spiritual communities. So again, communities of practice. So today, how is this relevant? So many people are looking for communities, a sense of belonging. There is a renewed interest in recovering sort of the feminine perspective, the softer, nurturing aspect of connection, communication, even collaboration, and businesses that have a cause, working together for a cause to serve. So whether you're in areas of self-leadership, if you're looking to explore new ways to practice spirituality, or leadership in corporate world or in your community or home. Why this matters is that for many ages, these traditions and wisdom have been shunned, vilified, suppressed, or even in India, right? For Ayurveda, oh my gosh, one of my passions is the science of life. Ayurveda was literally shunned, books burned, people imprisoned and not allowed to practice for I don't know how long. And it's taken a long time to bring this back into the surface. And now more than ever, Ayurveda and lifestyle medicine related type wisdom traditions are needed more than ever to address the common chronic conditions of lifestyle-based diseases. So that's just one way that we can look at the impact, the deleterious effects that dampening wisdom traditions throughout the ages can impact us today. So the resurgence is coming. It is here, right? The interest in sort of feminine wisdom. Again, not female, not he, she, but feminine, the quality. What are the traits and characteristics expressed? How do we express ourselves and bring those qualities, which are really nothing more than frequency, vibration, quality of nutrition, how it works in our mind and our body, and that how do we then share that energy with the world? And that is a form of what's known as Laya yoga, the infinite flow of energy as it changes and is shared and then it's transmitted. So when we reach for that beautiful, nourishing bowl of food, it nourishes our belly. When we reach for that YouTube that we're listening to, or that book that we're reading, or the sounds of the music that's helping us relax, we are literally a part of that process. So this is about reawakening the process to build those lives of greater meaning, of greater nourishment, of greater connection. So recovering these voices does not mean rejecting existing traditions, but rather expanding our understanding of wisdom to include perspectives that were previously ignored, dampened, and vilified. Okay, so wrapping up our big idea number 4, as we're looking at women's spiritual voices suppressed throughout history. Are we ready for the swing to come back and to bring in and embrace more of the feminine wisdom coming into our current society? What does that look like for you guys?
So this theme really resonated with me. And thank you for making a big idea number 4. And actually, thank you for the past 4 years, because it became a big idea for me personally when we met on Clubhouse. And my thesis at the time, and I've, yeah, and it's still very much, again, one of my core principles and big ideas that I'm trying to embody. And it's a parable shift, not a paradigm. You mentioned paradigm earlier, but a parable shift. And for instance, the story of Lilith, reclaiming feminine leadership, reclaiming the story, the seat of authority, wisdom, right? So all of that for me really resonates when it comes to, moving from suppression to reclaiming, and really celebrating the embodiment, women as the embodiment of wisdom, or celebrating again. It is, not necessarily that dichotomous approach, but rather embracing the fact that it is in our, nature to nurture. Again, that's harmony. And more a celebration. And so I'm really, as I said, that's something that really resonates with me. So it's good to be able to reclaim that. And even the lineage, and that there is a hidden lineage, right? And so, and I think the timing of it, and as Colin mentioned earlier, in terms of foretelling, I think it's absolutely in decentralization. It is a pathway, an option to practice, to embody. And it's not necessarily, and this is the other thing that for me, was challenging because, especially in the case of Lilith, it shouldn't necessarily be that feminine leadership is relegated to the corners, the dark corners, as esoteric knowledge. I find, personally, that is not how I wish to see or celebrate feminine leadership. Not, in a dark corner and relegated from that, or even the parable of, like, I think of Lady Macbeth as a literary hero. Women can and women are powerful, deservedly in terms of seat of authority, of political leadership, of feminine leadership, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, painted as some sort of dark arts or ambition. So that is something that I'd like to reclaim, that I'm, looking to celebrating the embodiment of wisdom, women as.
Thank you, Archana. And before we move towards closing reflections, we'd really like you to just think about what idea from today's conversation resonated most with you today, to really write it down and just take a moment to reflect. How is this impacting me today? So if you download the worksheet or write in your wellness journal, we invite you each discussion to really focus on your one takeaway. And you might also ask yourself something like, is this a book that you want to add to your library? So we always want to encourage, one of our goals here in the Literary Cafe is to simply help more people read more books and discover more meaningful topics to explore with their community. And we invite you to keep track of how many books have you read this year. So this little handy dandy worksheet kind of tabulates it at the corner. So in mind with that, I'd love to hear one final reflection from my amazing co-host today on just one word, one idea that's landing with you as we wrap up today's discussion.
I guess for me, it's how almost like the hidden history of feminine wisdom is finally emerging. That there's, in my opinion, a holistic revelation of the merging of the rational and the somatic experience of the spiritual. It's when I first heard the topic, I thought immediately of the Gnostic text, the Gospel of Mary, and the struggle that she had when she began to reveal after the crucifixion that she had had direct conversation. And Peter, as any man would do, said, "Who are you to have? I can't believe he spoke to you personally. How did he do that and not tell us?" And oh man, have women been facing that from throughout time, And then what she ends up speaking, if you've ever touched that text, is just gold. It's just completely aligned with what you've brought up here today, Maggie. So thank you.
Fascinating me. I'm like, what? It's like, tell me more. I want to know more.
Oh my. If you have not heard of the Gnostic Gospels, you need to get this book for that. And then it leads to other books that you can read. I can't flip to it quick enough, but that whole chapter on the Gnostics, the revelation and the impact that Constantinople decided, one person decided what will go in the Bible and what will not. So this book is not for the faint of heart. If you're reading about, truths, global truths, lives, traditions, wisdom, and the impact that one person, in most cases, a masculine, a male leader, suppressing not only feminine wisdom, but wisdom, and deciding for cultures and people and consciousness on what will be truth, what will be related wisdom to be passed down and to be honored. My friends, if you haven't, that should be big idea number 6, right? With that, let's take a look at the 4 big ideas as we now come to our summary portion. We want to thank the listeners for this, again, lengthy conversation today. This is definitely a book that we can take and spend hours with. And we hope that you do purchase the book or get it at the library or download it in Audible and spend some time reviewing some of these ideas to explore pathways of meaning and bring that greater sense of purpose into your direction in life. Paula Marvelly introduces us to remarkable women across cultures and centuries whose lives and teachings illuminate humanity's enduring search for freedom. And what becomes clear as we move through these stories is that these women were not simply thinkers, they were seekers and teachers and pioneers of spiritual transformation. So let's go through the big ideas one by one very quickly. So, idea one is the hidden lineage of women mystics. We explored that throughout history, there has always been a powerful lineage of women mystics, philosophers, and spiritual teachers, even though their contributions have often been overlooked in traditional historical narratives. From ancient priestesses and philosophers to medieval mystics and modern spiritual seekers, these women offered insights about consciousness, devotion, and self realization that deeply influenced spiritual traditions across the world. So their voices really remind us that wisdom has never belonged to one culture, one religion, or one gender. It has always emerged from individuals willing to question, explore, and seek deeper truths. Idea two, the path of inner transformation. This discussed that many of these women describe spirituality not simply as a belief, but as a path of inner transformation. And there were many traditions, whether Christian mysticism, Sufi devotion, Buddhist practice, or contemplative philosophy, these teachers all pointed towards a similar journey, a movement inward towards self knowledge, humility, compassion, and many other lived values, ultimately with a deeper experience of the sacred. So, this idea reminds us that wisdom traditions across cultures often describe transformation as that process, not a single insight or outcome. And idea three is the courage to speak spiritual truth. This was threaded throughout the book for the women who expressed their spiritual insights in societies that often limited and suppressed women's voices. Many of the figures highlighted by Marvelly showing how much these women faced skepticism, resistance, or even persecution. And yet they continue to believe and think and write and teach and share their visions of spiritual life. Their stories reveal how wisdom traditions often evolve through individuals who are willing to speak truthfully about their experiences, even when those experiences challenge the assumptions of their time and cost them their lives. And the last idea, my friends, is why these voices still matter today. We need to explore why these stories remain so meaningful in our lives today. The teaching of these women remind us that the search for wisdom is not confined to monasteries or ancient times or past times. It is something that unfolds today in everyday life through our own curiosity, reflection, our questions, and the courage to ask those deeper questions about who we are and how we live. So, in many ways, the women in this book invite us to consider what it might mean to live with greater awareness, compassion, and authenticity in our own time. So, taken together, these four ideas reveal something really beautiful that across cultures and centuries, there has always been a quiet but powerful set of traditions and feminine wisdom guiding humanity's search for meaning. We hope that some of these have landed with you. And perhaps one of the most important invitations from this book is simply to listen again, to pause and be listening to those voices and to consider what they might still be teaching us today. So thank you, my friends, for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's conversation, we'd love to invite you to join us again next week as we focus and continue on Women's Wisdom Month. Next week, we're going to be diving into the Latina Bible. So I'm really curious to explore that one. And then we're going to wrap up the month on yoga and the quest for the true self. So different versions, different cultures, different lens. So we invite you to come back. And until next time, this is Pause and Pivot, a space where readers, thinkers, and seekers gather to explore ideas, ask better questions, and learn from each other. Because Sometimes the most powerful thing a book can do is start a conversation. And here in Pause and Pivot, we pause not to stop, but to pivot towards what matters. Thanks for joining us, our friends, and see you again next time.